Her knees hit the frozen ground first, then her hands. She was still crawling toward the light in the window when the door flew open and a man's shadow fell over her. And the last thing she managed to say before the world went black was, "Please, I'll do anything. Just don't send me back out there." If stories like this one move, you hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The cold had a sound to it that night. Not wind exactly, something underneath the wind, a low groaning that came off the mountains and rolled through Red Hollow like the land itself was in pain. Every window in town was shuttered against it. Every dog was inside. Every sane creature with blood in its veins had found a wall to hide behind hours ago. Clara Whitmore was not behind a wall. She had been walking since before dawn, and now the sky outside the saloon window had gone the color of a bruised purple sliding into black, and she still had not found a single door that would open for her. Her boots had stopped being boots somewhere around noon. They were just shapes now packed with snow-numb blocks she dragged forward, because stopping meant lying down, and lying down meant not getting up. She pushed open the saloon door with both hands, because one hand didn't have the strength left in it. The warmth hit her like a wall, and she nearly went down right there in the doorway. Smoke, whiskey, wet wool, the smell of 100 nights just like this one that had nothing to do with her. Every head in the room turned. "Well, would you look at that?" someone said, and there was laughter under it, ugly and quick. Clara didn't look at the man who said it. She had learned over 300 miles of walking which voices were worth answering and which ones you let pass through, you like weather. "I need work," she said. Her voice came out cracked thinner than she meant it to. She tried again, louder. "I need work. I can cook. I can clean. I can mend clothes. I can nurse a sick animal. I can muck a stall faster than any man in this room. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance." Silence answered her first. Then more laughter, the kind that has teeth in it. "Honey," the bartender said, wiping a glass that was already clean. "Ain't a ranch in this territory gonna hire a woman who looks like she's one gust of wind from the grave. Go home." "I don't have a home." The words came out flat, because she had said them so many times now they'd stopped hurting the way they used to. "My father's dead. The farm's sold. I have $11 and a coat that doesn't keep out the cold anymore. So no, sir, I am not going home. I am going to work. Somewhere. Tonight if I have to." A big man near the stove, color, somebody called him, broad through the shoulders, with a face like a fist pushed back from his table, and stood up slow, the way a man stands when he thinks the room is his. "Tell you what," he said, and his eyes moved over her in a way that made her stomach turn even in her exhaustion. "I got a bed at my place. Warm. Private. You want a job that bad, sweetheart? I got one for you." The laughter that followed was worse than the first laughter. Clara felt her face go hot, despite the cold still locked in her bones. And for one terrible second, she thought her legs were going to fold under her, not from the walk, not from the hunger, but from the sheer weight of being looked at, like she was something to be picked up off the road and used. "I said work," she said, and her voice shook, but it did not break. "Not that. Never that. Suit yourself." Color shrugged and sat back down, already bored, already reaching for his drink. "Door's right behind you." That was when her legs finally did what they'd been threatening to do for the last mile. The room tilted. The lantern light smeared into long yellow streaks. She heard herself say something later she wouldn't remember what, and then the floor came up to meet her, except it didn't, because someone caught her before she landed. "Easy." A man's voice low, close to her ear. "I've got you. You're not hitting that floor." She came back into her own body, slowly aware, first of the warmth of a coffee mug being pressed into her hands, then of a face coming into focus. A man maybe in his mid-30s, jaw dark with 2 days of stubble eyes, the gray of a sky before snow. He was crouched in front of her chair, close enough that she could see he wasn't looking at her the way Color had. He was looking at her the way you'd look at something you were afraid might break. "Drink," he said. "Slow. You've been out in that storm a long time. Your stomach won't thank you for going fast." "Who?" Her throat was raw. "Who are you?" Nathan Cole. He said it simply, no weight on it, like it was just a fact and not a name half the men in that saloon had gone quiet at the sound of. I own a spread about 6 miles north of here. Culler's voice cut in from across the room, sour now. Cole, mind your business. Woman's not your problem. Nathan didn't even turn his head. She's not a problem at all. That's the part you're getting wrong. Something shifted in the room. Clara felt it even through the fog of exhaustion, a kind of held breath, like everyone was waiting to see what happened when a man like Nathan Cole decided to plant his feet. I don't need rescuing, Clara said, because pride was the one thing the winter hadn't managed to take from her yet. I need a job. I heard you the first time. Nathan stood, and even that small motion had a kind of contained control to it, like a man who'd spent his whole life being careful with things that could break. You said you can cook, clean, mend, work with animals. I can do all of that and more, and I'll do it better than anyone you've got. I don't doubt it. He studied her for a long moment, and there was nothing in his face she could read, not pity, not hunger, not the things she'd learned to brace against. But I'm not looking for a worker. Her stomach dropped. Of course. Of course there was a catch. There was always a catch. Then I'm sorry to have wasted your time, she said, and started to push herself up out of the chair, gathering what was left of her dignity around her like a second coat. Sit down. It wasn't unkind, but it wasn't a request either. I didn't say I don't need help. I said I'm not looking for a worker. Then what in God's name are you looking for? The whole saloon seemed to lean in without moving an inch. A wife, Nathan said. For a moment Clara was certain she'd misheard him, that the cold and the hunger had finally scrambled something behind her eyes. She stared at him, waiting for the laugh that would tell her this was a joke at her expense, one more cruelty in a day that had been made entirely of them. The laugh didn't come. I'm sorry, she said carefully. You're what? I have a ranch, Nathan said, and he said it like he was laying facts on a table, not like a man making a proposal. Good land, good water, a house with 4 empty rooms in it. I have more cattle than I can properly tend alone, and a house that hasn't had a fire lit in the good parlor in 3 years, because there's no point lighting a fire for one man eating alone. I'm not offering you a job scrubbing my floors. Miss Whitmore, Clara Whitmore. Miss Whitmore? I'm offering you a partnership, a name, a roof that won't leak, a say in how the place is run, not orders barked at you like you're hired help. In exchange, you'd be my wife in truth, not in name, only a home built together, not a servant kept in a spare room. The saloon had gone so quiet Clara could hear the fire cracking in the stove. You don't know me, she said. It was the only thing she could think to say. You've known me for 4 minutes. I know you walked here in a blizzard that's killed grown men with more meat on their bones than you, Nathan said. I know you turned down Culler's offer, without blinking, even half frozen and starving, because you'd rather freeze with your dignity than survive without it. I know most people who say they'll do anything are lying, and you're not. That's not knowing a person. That's watching them for 4 minutes in a saloon. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his face. Fair enough. So don't answer tonight. I'm not asking you to swear an oath in front of these vultures. His eyes flicked briefly contemptuously toward Culler's table. I'll pay for a room at the boarding house. Hot food, a real bed, as many nights as you need to think. If you decide it's not for you, I'll still see you get honest work somewhere in this territory. You have my word. And if your word's worth nothing, Clara asked, because 300 miles of walking had taught her that kindness could be a mask same as cruelty could. Nathan didn't flinch from the question. Then you'll have lost nothing but a few warm nights you were going to need anyway. I'm not asking you to trust me, Miss Whitmore. I'm asking you to let me prove I'm telling the truth. Culler snorted from across the room. Ain't that sweet? Cole finally found himself a new wife to replace the one he lost, and he found her half dead on the floor of a saloon. Real romantic. Something moved behind Nathan's eyes. Quick dark gone almost before Clara saw it. He didn't turn around. His voice when it came was even quieter than before, which somehow made it worse for Culler than shouting would have. "You'll want to be careful what you say about my wife," Nathan said. "Even the one I lost." Color's mouth shut like a trap snapping closed. Clara sat very still, the coffee mug warm in her two hands, and looked at this stranger who had just in the space of a saloon argument defended a dead woman's memory and offered a living one a way out of the cold. She didn't understand him. She didn't trust the ease of it, the way the offer had landed in her lap like something too good to be a coincidence. But she also hadn't eaten since the day before, and outside, the wind was still howling like something starving. "One room," she said finally. "One night. That's all I'm agreeing to." "That's all I asked for." Nathan straightened, reached into his coat, and set several coins on the bar without looking away from her. "Marta, get her a room upstairs, hot water, and whatever's left of that stew. Put it on my account." The woman behind the bar, Marta apparently, who ran the boarding rooms above the saloon, was already moving, already wrapping a shawl tighter around her shoulders, like she was preparing to be kind for once, in a room that didn't specialize in it. Nathan turned back to Clara one last time before he left. "I'll come by tomorrow afternoon, not to press you, just to see how you're faring." He hesitated, and for the first time that whole night, something uncertain crossed his face, some crack in the careful control. "For what it's worth, Miss Whitmore, I wasn't lying when I said I don't need another worker. I've got hands enough for the cattle. What I don't have anymore is a reason to come in from the cold at the end of the day." He was gone before she could answer out into the howling dark, and Clara sat there with a coffee going cold in her hands and a proposal ringing in her ears that made absolutely no sense, and yet somehow felt more honest than anything anyone had said to her in a year. The room Marta gave her was small, but it had a fire in it, and after the last 3 nights, Clara had spent one in a barn that wasn't hers, one under a rock overhang with her knees pulled to her chest, one she didn't like to remember at all. A small room with a fire in it felt like the inside of heaven. She ate the stew slower than her body wanted her to, because she'd learned that too. Somewhere in the last 2 months, eat too fast on an empty stomach, and you'll lose it all again just as quick. She sat by the window instead, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of lye soap, and watched the snow come down sideways past the glass, and thought about a stranger's gray eyes and the strange plain way he'd said the word wife, like it wasn't a cage. He was offering her, but a door. She didn't trust it. She told herself that firmly, the way you tell yourself something you're afraid you might stop believing. Men who wanted something for nothing didn't exist, not in her experience, not since her father died, and the vultures had come circling before the ground on his grave was even settled. There had been a lawyer in her hometown who'd offered to look after her interest for a price that turned out to be more than the whole estate was worth. There had been a neighbor who'd offered her a room in his house that came with expectations he hadn't bothered to hide past the second night. She had learned to smell a trap from a mile off. And yet, Nathan Cole hadn't touched her, hadn't leered, hadn't made his offer sound like rescue, like she owed him something for it. He'd made it sound like a business arrangement between equals, which was, she thought, either the cleverest kind of manipulation she'd ever encountered or the strangest kind of honesty. She didn't sleep well, but she slept. He came the next afternoon exactly when he said he would. Snow still falling, but softer now, more like the sky sifting flour than the violence of the night before. Clara met him downstairs in the saloon, which in daylight looked smaller and sadder than it had at midnight, all the danger drained out of it, along with most of the customers. "You look better," Nathan said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, like he was giving her room to correct him if she wasn't. "I feel less like a corpse, if that's what you're asking." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "That's an improvement, I suppose." They sat across from each other at a table near the window, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything, the silence stretching out comfortable in a way Clara didn't expect from a man she'd known less than a day. "I want to ask you something," she said finally, "and I want an honest answer, not a kind one." "All right. Your wife, the one Color mentioned last night. What happened to her?" Something in Nathan's face closed just slightly, like a door pulled to, but not latched. "Fever took her. 4 years ago this spring. We'd been married 2 years. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, an idle motion that Clara suspected wasn't idle at all. I built that house for her. Every room. I keep thinking I'll get around to using all of them someday, and instead I just close the doors. I'm sorry. Don't be. It's not a story I tell for sympathy. I'm telling you because you asked for honest, and I figure a woman who walked through a blizzard for the truth deserves it plain. He looked up at her. I'm not looking to replace her. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters to you, and it should. Whatever this is, whatever you decide, it's not going to be some pale copy of what I had before. It'll be its own thing, or it won't be anything at all. Clara turned that over in her mind, testing its weight, looking for the crack in it that would tell her it was a lie. She didn't find one. That frightened her more than if she had. Why me? She asked. You could have any woman in this territory who wanted a ranch and a name. Why a stranger who fell through your saloon door half dead? Nathan considered the question like it deserved consideration, not a quick answer thrown out to flatter her. Because most people, when hardship finds them, they start looking for someone to blame or someone to save them. You didn't ask to be saved last night. You asked for work. Even flat on the floor with nothing left in you, you asked for a chance to earn your way, not a handout. He shrugged like it embarrassed him slightly to say it plain. That's rarer than you'd think. I've watched men with full bellies and warm beds complain more in a week than you did after 300 miles of walking. You don't know it was 300 miles. Wasn't it? She didn't answer, which was answer enough. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you this isn't strange, Nathan said. It's strange, I know that. If my brother were alive, he'd tell me I'd gone soft in the head offering marriage to a woman I met in a snowstorm. But I've spent 4 years doing everything the sensible way, Miss Whitmore, and sensible hasn't gotten me anything but an empty house and cattle that don't care whether I come home at night or not. I'd rather take one chance on something real than keep living careful and alone. Clara looked down at her hands chapped raw from the cold and thought about the $11 in her coat pocket, about the eviction notice still folded in her bag with her father's name on it, about the long list of doors that had closed on her in the last 2 months. I won't be a servant, she said, lifting her chin. If I say yes and I haven't said yes, I won't be someone who cooks your meals and warms your bed and has no more say in her own life than one of your cattle. I've had enough of people deciding what I'm worth. I decide that now. Good, Nathan said. And there was something like relief in it, or maybe respect. Because I wasn't offering the other kind. She didn't say yes that day. She didn't say yes the day after either. Though Nathan came back. Both afternoons, sat with her, asked nothing of her but conversation about her father, about the farm she'd grown up on, about small foolish things like her favorite season, and whether she could ride a horse. She could. Not well, but she could. On the third day, Marta cornered her on the stairs, hands on her hips, voice pitched low so it wouldn't carry. You're a fool if you say no to that man, Marta said. You don't know him. I've poured his drinks for 6 years. I know he's never once raised his voice at a woman in this saloon, never once cheated a man out of a fair wage, and never once, not once, come in here looking for what half the men in this territory come looking for. That's more than most women get told about a husband before the wedding, let alone after. Marta's face softened just slightly. I also know what it looks like when a person's got nowhere left to walk to, girl. You had that look coming through my door 3 nights ago. You want to walk back out into that and find out where the next door closes on you. Clara didn't answer. But that night, lying awake with the fire burned down to embers, she found herself thinking not about the cold anymore, not about the $11 or the closed doors, but about the way Nathan Cole had said the word partnership, like it was a promise he intended to keep. She found him the next morning outside the general store, checking over a wagon load of supplies with the kind of quiet competence that told her everything about how he ran his land, even without seeing it. He looked up when she approached, and something in his face went very still. The way a man goes still when he's bracing for news he's not sure he wants. Miss Whitmore? I have conditions, Clara said before her nerve could fail her. Nathan set down the crate he was holding. I'm listening. I want it understood plainly before God and whoever else is fool enough to witness it that I am your wife and not your housekeeper. I want a say in how the ranch accounts are kept because I won't be kept in the dark about money the way my father kept my mother in the dark. And look how that ended. I want my own horse, not a borrowed one. And I want the truth from you always, even when it's easier to give me something softer." Nathan's mouth twitched, and this time it was unmistakably close to a real smile. "Is that all? For now?" "Done. All of it." He held out his hand, not to shake exactly, more like an offering. "Anything else you decide you need, you tell me plain, and we'll settle it plain. That's how I want this to run, Clara. Not orders, not secrets. Just two people being honest with each other about what they need." It was the first time he'd used her given name. It landed somewhere in her chest she wasn't prepared for. "All right," she said, and her voice barely shook at all. "Nathan Cole, I'll marry you." Behind them, through the store window, Marta let out a whoop loud enough to startle a horse tied at the rail, and for the first time in 2 months, Clara Whitmore laughed a real laugh, surprised out of her the sound of it strange in her own ears after so long spent just surviving. The wedding 3 days later was the plainest thing Clara had ever seen. No church bells because Red Hollow didn't have a proper church. Just a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through and agreed to say the words in the front room of the boarding house. No dress, but the one good one Marta had lent her, taken in at the waist, because Marta was built heavier than Clara's storm-thinned frame. No flowers, because it was the dead of winter and nothing grew. But Nathan stood across from her with his hat in his hands and his eyes steady on hers, and when he said, "I do," he said it like a man laying the cornerstone of something he intended to build for the rest of his life, not like a man closing a transaction. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher said. And there was a beat of hesitation, both of them aware, in that small charged silence, that this was still new. Still strange, two people who'd known each other 8 days, standing in front of God with a promise between them. Nathan leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away if she wanted to. She didn't. The kiss was brief, careful, more a question than a claim, and when he drew back there was something uncertain and hopeful in his face that made him look for just a moment much younger than 35. "Mrs. Cole," he said quietly, testing the name. "Mr. Cole," Clara answered, and found she liked the sound of it more than she'd expected to. The ride out to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours, the wagon cutting fresh tracks through snow that hadn't been touched since the last storm. Clara sat beside Nathan under a shared blanket, watching the mountains rise up pale and enormous against a sky scrubbed clean of clouds, and felt something in her chest she hadn't let herself feel in a long time, something close to hope. Fragile as new ice. But there, Nathan said, and pointed. The house sat in a wide valley, ringed by dark pine, 2 stories of good timber, with a porch running the length of the front smoke, rising thin from a single chimney. It was, Clara thought, exactly the kind of house a man built when he still believed in a future. And exactly the kind of house that looked wrong somehow, standing so quiet and half alive against the white. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. "It's empty," Nathan said, and something in his voice told her that word carried more weight than the house's size or its silence. "Has been a long time. I built 4 bedrooms because I thought—" He stopped himself, cleared his throat. "I built it for a family. Never got the chance to fill it." Clara looked at the dark windows, the porch swept clean by wind rather than by hands, and understood with a clarity that startled her exactly why a man like Nathan Cole had stood up in a saloon and offered marriage to a half-frozen stranger. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't even loneliness, not exactly. It was a house waiting to become a home, and a man who'd run out of ways to make that happen alone. "Well," she said, climbing down from the wagon before he could help her, plunging her boots into snow that came nearly to her knee. "It won't be empty for long. I intend to make quite a lot of noise in it." Something in Nathan's face loosened relief maybe, or the first real unguarded happiness she'd seen from him since the saloon. "I'm counting on it, Mrs. Cole." Inside the house was as fine as its face promised: good stone hearth, solid furniture, a kitchen well stocked, but clearly untouched by anyone who cooked for pleasure rather than necessity. Clara moved through the downstairs rooms, slowly trailing her hand along a mantel gone dusty with disuse, and felt the particular strangeness of standing in a place that was, as of an hour ago, legally hers, and yet belonged entirely to a life she hadn't lived yet. "There's a room upstairs," Nathan said, hovering in the doorway with the careful awkwardness of a man unused to having anyone to explain his own house to. "That gets the morning light. I thought if you wanted it, it could be yours. Separate for now, however long you need." Clara turned to look at him surprised, and found him watching her with a kind of nervous honesty that undid some knot of tension she hadn't realized she was still carrying. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you know." "This isn't a house where anyone gets pushed into anything," Nathan said. "Not by me, not ever." It was, Clara thought, the second time in a week a man had made her a promise that sounded too good to trust, and the second time she found herself, despite every hard lesson the last 2 months had taught her, wanting badly to believe it. She was still standing in the front room, coat half off her shoulders, when she noticed the framed photograph on the side table near the window. A young woman with dark hair and a serious, gentle face, dressed in the fashion of some years back. Clara's stomach tightened before she could stop it. Nathan followed her gaze and went very still. "That's Rebecca," he said. "My first wife." "You don't have to explain. I want to." He crossed the room, picked up the frame with a gentleness that spoke of old grief worn smooth by time, and set it carefully in a drawer of the side table, not hidden away entirely, but no longer facing out into the room. "This isn't her house anymore. It's yours too now. I should have done that before you arrived, and I'm sorry I didn't think of it." "You don't need to erase her for me," Clara said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "I don't need to be the only woman who ever lived here. I just need to know I'm not living in her shadow." "You're not." Nathan's voice was low, certain. "You never will be." That first week tested every promise either of them had made in that saloon. They were in every practical sense strangers sharing a roof, polite at breakfast, careful at supper, each learning the particular silence of the other's habits. Clara threw herself into the work of the house with something like ferocity, scrubbing floors that didn't need scrubbing, reorganizing a kitchen that had clearly not been touched with any real intention in years, because work was the one language she'd always understood, the one thing that made the strangeness of her new life feel less like standing on ice that might crack at any moment. Nathan, for his part, disappeared into the cattle work from sunup to well past dark, as though he too needed the excuse of labor to avoid the more delicate work of learning to live beside someone. It was Clara who broke the pattern first. On the 5th night she found him in the barn, long after supper had gone cold on the stove, sitting on an overturned bucket with a lantern beside him, working a strip of leather through his hands without any particular purpose that she could see. "You missed supper," she said. Nathan looked up, startled guilt crossing his face plain as daylight. "I'm sorry. I lost track of the hour." "You've lost track of the hour every night this week." She came further into the barn, arms crossed against the cold, and studied him in the lantern light. The tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw worked like he was chewing on words he hadn't decided whether to say. "Nathan, what's wrong?" For a long moment he didn't answer. Then quietly, "I keep waiting to feel like I made a mistake, dragging you into this. A stranger into a house that still got her ghost in every corner, into a marriage that started because you were desperate and I was lonely." He set the leather strip down. "And every night I come in from the herd, and I smell supper cooking, and I hear you moving around in that kitchen like you belong there, and instead of feeling like I made a mistake, I feel—" He stopped. "You feel what?" Clara asked, and her heart was beating harder than the cold alone could explain. "Grateful," Nathan said. "Which scares me more than guilt ever did, because guilt I know how to carry. I don't know what to do with grateful." Clara crossed the barn and sat down on the crate beside his bucket, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Then don't do anything with it," she said. Just let it be true. I'm not asking you to stop missing her, Nathan. I'm asking you to let there be room for both the missing and this. They don't have to fight each other." He looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving behind his eyes. And for the first time since the saloon, Clara felt the strange, fragile thing between them shift into something that might given time become real. "Supper's cold," she said finally, standing, offering him her hand. "But I can warm it. Come inside before you freeze out here brooding." Nathan took her hand. His grip was rough with callous, and careful all the same, like a man who'd spent a lifetime learning exactly how much strength a thing could bear before it broke. "Clara," he said, not moving yet. "Thank you. For staying. For not running the first chance you got like half the territory probably expected you to." "I don't run," Clara said. "Not anymore. I walked 300 miles through a blizzard to stop running. I'm not about to start again now." Duh. But the valley, for all its quiet beauty, was not as forgiving of a marriage of convenience as Nathan and Clara wanted to believe. Word travels fast in cattle country, faster than snow melts, and by the second week, half the ranchers within 20 miles knew the story of Nathan Cole and the half-frozen stranger he'd married in a boarding house parlor. Most of the talk was harmless enough. Curiosity, a little gossip over supply counters, the kind of attention any unusual match draws in a small territory. But not all of it was harmless. Clara first felt the sharper edge of it on a trip into town for supplies, standing at the counter of the general store, while the owner's wife, a thin, sharp-faced woman named Prudence Hale, looked her over with an expression that made Clara's skin prickle. "So you're the one," Prudence said, not quite a question. "I'm Clara Cole, if that's what you mean." Prudence's eyes traveled over Clara's coat, her boots, the flour and sugar she was purchasing, cataloging it all with the particular cruelty of a woman deciding exactly how much another woman was worth. "Nathan Cole's a fine catch for a woman with nothing. Land cattle a good name in this territory. Some might say you fell into quite a bit of luck collapsing on that saloon floor." "Some might say a lot of things," Clara said evenly, though her hand had gone tight around the sack of flour. "I'd be curious whether they'd say it to my face." Prudence's smile went thin and cold. "I'm only saying what half this territory's already thinking, dear. A woman with nothing marries a man with everything. People wonder how long it takes before she starts wondering what more she can get. Land's worth a great deal out here, cattle too. A man can lose a great deal marrying in haste." The words landed exactly where they were meant to. A small poisoned seed dropped into soil that Clara hadn't realized was still soft enough to take root. She thought of Nathan's ledgers, which she hadn't yet asked to see. She thought of the deed to the ranch, whose details she didn't fully understand. She thought, with a cold twist in her stomach, of how very little she actually knew about the legal shape of the life she'd just married into, and how very much people like Prudence Hale seemed to enjoy pointing that out. "Good day," Clara said stiffly, and left before her voice could betray how deep the barb had gone. She didn't mention the encounter to Nathan that night. Some instinct told her it would only hurt him hearing that his neighbors thought so little of the woman he'd chosen, and some smaller, more private instinct told her she needed to sit with the sting of it herself. First decide how much of it was poison, and how much, if any, was a warning worth heeding. It was 3 nights later that the warning found her again, this time not from a gossiping shopkeeper's wife, but from a man. He arrived at the ranch on a fine gray horse, dressed sharper than any cattleman had reason to dress, with the kind of smile that Clara distrusted on sight, the way you distrust a smooth patch of ice you can't tell is thin or thick. "Mrs. Cole," he said, tipping his hat with theatrical courtesy from atop his horse, while Nathan was still out with the herd. "Byron Ashford. I own the Ashford land holdings west of the ridge. I've been meaning to pay my respects to the new Mrs. Cole." "That's kind of you, Mr. Ashford." Clara kept her tone polite, but something about the man set every instinct in her on alert. The too easy charm, the way his eyes moved over the house behind her, like he was assessing its worth on paper. "Nathan's out with the cattle if you're looking for him. Actually," Ashford said, dismounting with practiced grace. I was rather hoping to speak with you. Woman to well. New arrival to new arrival, in a sense. I understand you're not from cattle country. I'm learning. I'm sure you are. His smile widened, and there was something underneath it Clara couldn't name yet, but didn't like. I only wanted to say, should you ever find the life out here more than you bargained for, should you ever want options, my door's always open. A woman finds herself in an arrangement that doesn't suit her. It helps to know she's not without friends in this territory. The offer, vague as it was, curdled something in Clara's stomach. I don't believe I understand your meaning, Mr. Ashford. No need to understand it today. He swung back up onto his horse with the same easy grace, tipping his hat once more. Just remember it's there. Good land, this valley. Cole's got some of the finest water rights for 50 miles. Man's lucky to have it. Lucky to have kept it given some of the irregularities in how that deed came to be filed. Good day, Mrs. Cole. He rode off before Clara could ask him what exactly he meant by irregularities, and she stood on the porch a long time after his horse had disappeared over the ridge. That single word, turning over and over in her mind like a stone, she couldn't put down. She waited until after supper to raise it, watching Nathan's face carefully as she described the visit, Prudence Hale's comments about land and luck, and now this stranger with his smooth voice and his talk of irregularities in the deed. Nathan's expression, which had been easy and warm through most of the meal, went carefully blank in a way Clara was beginning to recognize as the look of a man locking a door before she could see what was behind it. Byron Ashford came here, he said slowly, and talked to you about the deed. He implied there was something wrong with it, something about how it came to be filed. Clara set down her fork. Nathan, is there something about this land I should know? For a long moment Nathan said nothing, and in that silence, Clara felt the first real crack of doubt she'd had since the wedding. Not doubt about him exactly, but doubt about what she'd walked into, about how much of her new life was built on ground as solid as it looked. There's history between the Ashfords and my family, Nathan said finally, choosing each word like it cost him something. Old history. Byron's father tried to buy this valley from mine years before I was born, and my father refused, and it's been a sore point between our families ever since. The deed is clean, Clara. I'd stake my life on it. But Byron Ashford has spent 20 years looking for a crack in it, and he's not above manufacturing one if he can't find it honest. Manufacturing how? I don't know yet. Nathan's jaw tightened. But a man like Byron doesn't ride 6 miles out of his way to make idle conversation with a new bride. If he's talking to you about irregularities in my deed, it means he's planning something, and I intend to find out what before it finds us. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters, and Clara found herself thinking that the storm she'd walked through to get here might not have been the last one waiting for her in this valley, that some storms didn't come from the sky at all. And this one, she suspected, was only just beginning to gather. Whatever it is, she said quietly, reaching across the table to still Nathan's restless hand. We'll face it together. That was the promise, wasn't it? Not orders, not secrets, just two people honest with each other. Nathan looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and grateful moving behind his gray eyes, and turned his hand over to hold hers properly. That was the promise, he said. And I intend to keep it, starting with finding out exactly what Byron Ashford thinks he knows about my land before he has the chance to use it against either one of us. Outside, the snow had started falling again, soft and steady, blanketing the valley in white. But for the first time since she'd married him, Clara understood that the danger to her new life wasn't going to come from the winter at all. The morning after Byron Ashford's visit, Nathan was gone from the house before the sun fully cleared the ridge, and Clara found the note he'd left on the kitchen table, block letters pressed hard into the paper like he'd been gripping the pencil too tight. Riding to the county recorder's office. Back by dark. Don't let anyone onto the property who isn't family. N. She read it twice, feeling the weight of those last words settle in her chest. Don't let anyone onto the property. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a stranger sleeping in a saloon room, paid for by a man she didn't know. And now she was being trusted to guard a house, A name. A piece of land that apparently had enemies circling it like wolves testing a fence line. She didn't have long to sit with the feeling. By mid-morning, a wagon came rattling up the drive, and Clara's stomach tightened until she recognized the driver. An older woman, broad and weathered, with a face that looked like it had spent 40 years arguing with weather and winning most of the time. "You're the new Mrs. Cole," the woman said, climbing down without waiting for an invitation. "I'm Hazel Prentice. My husband and I run the spread just east of here. Figured somebody decent ought to come welcome you before the vultures finish picking you apart." "You've heard about the vultures then?" "Honey, I've heard about the vultures since before you finished your vows." Hazel snorted and pushed past her toward the porch steps uninvited, but somehow not unwelcome. Prudence Hale's tongue could strip paint off a barn door, and Byron Ashford's been sniffing around this valley since his daddy died and left him nothing but debts and a grudge. You put the two of them together, and of course they're going to make a story out of a woman surviving a blizzard. Clara found herself, despite everything, almost smiling. "You don't believe the story then?" "I believe you walked 300 miles in a snowstorm rather than lie down and die," Hazel said, settling herself into a porch chair like she owned it. "That tells me plenty. Now go put a pot of coffee on, because I intend to sit here until you tell me everything, and I don't intend to do it thirsty." It was over that pot of coffee that Clara learned the shape of the trouble she'd married into. "Ashford land runs the ridge west of here," Hazel said, cradling her cup in both hands. "Good grazing, but no water to speak of, not real water, not the kind that keeps cattle alive through a dry summer. Cole land has the river. Always has. Nathan's grandfather filed that claim back before this territory was even a territory, and the Ashfords have been trying to get their hands on it one way or another for 3 generations. Byron mentioned something about irregularities in the deed. Hazel's face went hard. "There's no irregularity. I've known that deed since I was a girl. But that won't stop a man like Byron Ashford from inventing one, if inventing one means he finally gets what his grandfather and his father both died wanting." She leaned forward. "You listen to me, Clara Cole. Whatever Byron says, whatever smooth story he spins, you do not trust one word out of that man's mouth. He's charming the way a rattlesnake's quiet right before it strikes. Nathan's gone to the recorder's office today to check the filing." "Good. Smart man." Hazel nodded approvingly. "You keep that deed close, you hear me? Copies if you can manage it. A man like Ashford doesn't need to steal land outright if he can just make enough people believe the paperwork's gone bad. Rumor does half his work for him." Clara turned that over, feeling the cold settle deeper into her stomach than the weather could account for. "Why are you telling me all this, Mrs. Prentice? You don't know me any better than Byron Ashford does." Hazel's weathered face softened just slightly. "Because I watched Nathan Cole bury his first wife, and I watched what 4 years alone in that house did to him, and I'll be damned if I sit by and let Byron Ashford take a second thing from that man just because he finally found a reason to smile again." She reached over and patted Clara's hand, rough and brief. "Besides, anybody Prudence Hale's decided to hate that fast is probably worth knowing." Nathan didn't return by dark, like his note promised. Clara told herself it meant nothing. A slow ride, a long line at the recorder's office roads made worse by the last snowfall. She told herself that through supper, through the dishes, through an hour of pacing the front room, watching the window go from gray to black. By the second hour past dark, telling herself things had stopped working. She was pulling her coat on half-formed plans of riding out to look for him, crowding her mind, despite not knowing the roads, when she heard hoofbeats coming up hard through the snow and threw the door open before he'd even reached the porch. "Nathan!" He came up the steps moving wrong. One arm held tight against his side, blood dark against the pale wool of his coat sleeve, and Clara's heart lurched so violently she nearly dropped the lamp in her hand. "You're hurt." "I'm fine." His voice was tight-controlled in the particular way of a man refusing to admit how much something hurt. "Someone took a shot at me on the road back, winged my arm. I'm fine, Clara. It's not deep. Someone shot you." She was already pulling him toward the kitchen table, already reaching for the kettle, her hands shaking now that the fear had somewhere to go. Nathan Cole, someone put a bullet in you and you're telling me you're fine. I've had worse from a mean-tempered bull. He sat, finally letting her peel back the ruined sleeve, and hissed through his teeth as she got her first proper look at the wound. A furrow along the outside of his upper arm, ugly but shallow. The kind of wound that told a story about a shooter who'd either missed on purpose or been unlucky. It grazed. I'll live. Who? Clara's hands didn't stop moving. Water-clean cloth, the whiskey bottle Nathan kept in the cabinet for exactly this kind of emergency, though she suspected he'd never expected to need it for a bullet wound. Did you see who did it? No. Whoever it was stayed back in the trees. One shot, then nothing. I didn't stick around to invite a second. Nathan's jaw was tight as she poured whiskey over the wound, and he sucked in a breath through his teeth. But I've got a fair idea who paid for the bullet, even if I can't prove it stood in front of a judge. Ashford. Ashford. Nathan's voice had gone hard flat, a tone Clara hadn't heard from him yet. I spent all day at the recorder's office. The deed's clean, Clara, clean as the day it was filed 60 years back. No irregularities, no cracks for a man like Byron to slip a claim through. He looked up at her, something grim and certain settling into his face. Which means if the deed won't give him a way in, he's decided he'll make one, starting apparently with putting a bullet in me on a public road. Clara's hands stilled on the bandage she was winding, cold fear turning sharp and clear into something closer to fury. He could have killed you. I don't think that was the intention. Not yet. Nathan's eyes met hers steady, despite the pain still written plain across his face. I think that was a warning. Ashford wants this land, and he's just told me without saying a single word to my face exactly how far he's willing to go to get it. Yo. Word of the shooting reached town before Clara and Nathan did the way bad news always outran good, and by the time they rode in 3 days later, Nathan's arm bound tight beneath his coat jaw, set against both the pain and the stares, half of Red Hollow already had an opinion about what had happened and who was to blame. Most of the opinions infuriatingly seemed to circle back to Clara. Strange, isn't it? Prudence Hale said loud enough to carry across the store, not quite looking at Clara, but clearly speaking for her benefit. How quiet things were around the Cole Ranch for years, and then a stranger marries in, and suddenly there's shooting on the road. Prudence. The store owner, a mild man who mostly wanted to sell flour in peace, shot his wife a warning look that she ignored entirely. I'm only saying what people are thinking. A woman appears out of nowhere, marries into land and cattle inside of a week, and now somebody's putting bullets in her husband. Makes a person wonder who benefits, doesn't it, if something worse were to happen to Nathan Cole. The words landed like a slap, and for a moment Clara simply stood there stunned by the sheer audacity of the accusation that she who'd nearly frozen to death walking into this territory, who'd bandaged Nathan's arm with her own shaking hands 3 nights ago, was somehow being painted as the one who'd arranged to have him shot. You think I had my own husband shot? Clara said, her voice very quiet. Very, even the kind of quiet that came from holding fury on a very short leash. 3 days after I bandaged the wound myself. For land I've owned exactly 19 days. I didn't say that, dear. You said exactly that, Mrs. Hale, in front of half this store, and you said it loud enough that I imagine it'll be repeated at every supper table in Red Hollow by tonight. Clara stepped closer, and something in her bearing, 300 miles of walked-through blizzard, a lifetime of doors closed in her face, straightened her spine in a way that made Prudence take an involuntary step back. I have buried a father. I have slept in barns that weren't mine. I have been offered things by men in this territory that I will not repeat in polite company. And I turned every one of them down because I would rather starve than take something dishonest. I did not walk 300 miles through a blizzard to marry a good man, and then arrange to have him killed for land. I could have simply asked him to share. Think what you like of me, Mrs. Hale. But you'll think it to my face from now on, not behind it. The store had gone completely silent. Even the storekeeper had stopped pretending to organize his shelves, watching with wide eyes. Prudence's mouth opened again, color rising high in her sharp face. Well, I never... No, Clara agreed. I don't imagine you have. She turned, collected her basket with hands that were only shaking a little, and walked out of the store with her head high, leaving a silence behind her that felt for the first time since she'd arrived in Red Hollow like something closer to respect than pity. Nathan was waiting outside with the wagon, and the look on his face told her he'd heard at least the tail end of it through the open door. "You didn't have to defend yourself in there," he said quietly, helping her up onto the seat. "I could have said something. I don't need you fighting my battles for me, Nathan Cole." Clara settled the basket at her feet, still breathing a little hard from the confrontation. "I've been fighting my own battles a long time. I just needed somewhere to aim it, and Prudence Hale made herself an easy target." Something that might have been pride flickered across Nathan's face. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." "You're doing fine so far." She glanced at him sideways. "How's the arm?" "Sore. Manageable." He clicked the reins and the wagon lurched forward, snow crunching under the wheels. "Clara, what Prudence said in there, about who benefits. You know that's not—" "I know," Clara said simply. "I don't need you to tell me you don't believe it. If you believed it, you wouldn't have married a woman who could barely stand up straight in a saloon 3 weeks ago and trusted her to bandage a bullet wound 3 nights ago without flinching." Nathan was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses around a rut in the road. "I meant what I said that first night. About wanting someone honest, not someone who tells me what's easy to hear. You just proved that twice over in the space of one conversation with Prudence Hale. I don't think I could have picked better if I'd spent a year looking." Clara felt the warmth of that settle somewhere under the cold, a small, steady thing that had nothing to do with the winter at all. "Careful, Mr. Cole. That almost sounded like a compliment. Don't let it go to your head," Nathan said. But there was real warmth in it now, the ghost of a smile breaking through the tension that had gripped his face since the shooting. "We've still got a man out there who put a bullet in my arm, and half a town ready to believe the worst of my wife. I'd say we've earned a little teasing between the trouble." The trouble, as it turned out, was only beginning. 3 nights later, Clara woke to the sound of the dogs going wild in the yard, a frantic high barking that cut through her sleep like a blade. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, throwing a shawl over her nightdress, and met Nathan in the hallway already dressed, rifle in hand, his face grim in the low light of the lamp he carried. "Stay inside," he said. "Nathan, stay inside, Clara. I mean it." His voice left no room for argument, and something in his face, fear, real fear, not for himself, but for her, made her nod, despite every instinct telling her to follow. She watched from the window as he crossed the yard toward the barn lamp swinging rifle raised, and her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. The dogs were still barking frantic, circling something near the fence line she couldn't quite see in the dark. A shot rang out. Clara's whole body went cold. She was moving before she'd decided to move out the door across the porch, ignoring every instruction Nathan had given her, because whatever was happening out there, she was not going to stand behind glass and wait to find out if her husband was alive or dead. "Nathan, I'm all right." His voice came back through the dark, tense but whole, and relief crashed through her so hard her knees nearly buckled. "Stay back. There's someone in the north pasture. They were cutting the fence." She reached him at the fence line, just as he was crouching beside a section of wire that had been deliberately cut, the ends still sharp and fresh, no rust, no wear. Someone had come with tools specifically to open a gap wide enough to drive cattle through. "They were trying to scatter the herd," Nathan said, his voice tight with fury, now that the immediate danger had passed. "Cut the fence, spook them out into the open where they'd be easy to steal, or easy to lose to wolves, or easy to drive off coal land altogether and onto somebody else's range, where the ownership gets a lot harder to prove." "Ashford. Who else?" Nathan straightened, staring out into the dark, where whoever had done this had clearly fled at the sound of his shot. "First a bullet on the road, now this. He's not just trying to scare us off with rumors anymore, Clara. He's trying to bleed us cattle money patients until we're too worn down to fight him when he finally makes his real move." Clara wrapped her arms tight around herself against the cold, watching her husband's face harden into something she hadn't seen there before, Not the careful, controlled man from the saloon. Not the tentative, hopeful man who'd shown her an empty room and offered her a choice. Something colder. Something that had finally run out of patience. "Then we don't let him wear us down," she said. "We fight back smarter than he's fighting dirty." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Snow starting to drift down again between them, and something in his expression shifted surprise. Maybe that she'd said, "we" instead of "you." That 3 weeks into a marriage of convenience, she was already standing beside him in the fight, instead of behind him. "We," he repeated slowly. "We," Clara confirmed. "I didn't marry into this ranch to watch someone try to take it out from under us. I married in. That makes his fight my fight too." The days that followed took on a grim new rhythm. Nathan riding the fence lines twice daily, checking for fresh cuts, keeping the rifle within reach even during chores that had never required it before. Clara found herself watching the tree line from the kitchen window with an alertness that hadn't been part of her life since the desperate weeks of walking, jumping at sounds that were probably nothing. Sleeping light enough that every creak of the house brought her half upright in bed. It was Hazel Prentice, who brought the next piece of the puzzle, arriving unannounced on a gray morning with her face set in hard, worried lines. "I heard about the fence," Hazel said without preamble, stepping down from her wagon before it had fully stopped. "And the shooting before that. Clara, I need you and Nathan both to hear something, and I need you to hear it plain because I've been sitting on it 2 days, trying to decide if it was my business to tell, and I've decided it is." Nathan came out from the barn at the sound of the wagon, wiping his hands on a rag, his face going tight at the sight of Hazel's expression. "What is it?" "My husband was in town yesterday at the land office filing paperwork on a water rights dispute of our own." Hazel's mouth pressed into a thin line. While he was there, he overheard the clerk talking to another man, didn't catch the whole conversation, but he caught enough. "Somebody's been asking questions about your father's original claim, Nathan. Specifically about the year it was filed, and whether there's any record of a prior claim on that same water source that might have been filed and lost before your father's ever went through." Nathan went very still. "There is no prior claim. My grandfather was the first white settler in this valley with legal standing. That's a matter of public record. That's what my husband thought too. But whoever's asking these questions doesn't seem to care what's true. They seem to care about what they can make a judge believe is true if they bring in the right lawyer, with the right paperwork, and enough money to make the argument sound convincing." Hazel's eyes were hard worried. "Nathan, I think Byron Ashford isn't just trying to scare you off your own land anymore. I think he's building a legal case, a false one, but a case all the same, and he's spending money to build it convincingly." The silence that followed stretched long and cold, the full weight of what Hazel was describing settling over all 3 of them, like the winter itself had found a new way to press down. "If he's willing to forge a claim," Clara said slowly, working through the logic even as it turned her stomach. "Then the shooting the fence, those aren't just to scare us. They're to weaken us. Financially. Emotionally. Make us desperate enough, tired enough, that by the time he brings his false claim to a judge, we're too worn down to fight it properly." "That's exactly what I think," Hazel said grimly. "And I think you've got less time than you'd like to prove your claim is airtight before he finds a judge willing to hear his." That night, after Hazel had gone and the house had settled into its usual uneasy quiet, Clara found Nathan at the kitchen table, a stack of papers spread in front of him in the lamplight. The deed-old letters, a faded map of the valley boundaries in handwriting she recognized even without being told as belonging to a man long dead. "My grandfather's hand," Nathan said quietly, without looking up, tracing a finger along the edge of the map. "He drew this the year he filed the claim. Every boundary marker, every water source, all of it documented before anyone else in this territory thought to put a legal claim on paper at all." He looked up at her, exhaustion and worry carved deep into his face. "It's all here, Clara. Every proof I need. But proof only matters if I can get it in front of a judge before Ashford gets his lies in front of one first." Then we go to the territorial capital. Clara pulled out the chair beside him, studying the papers spread across the table with the same careful attention she'd have given a ledger back on her father's farm before everything had fallen apart. We don't wait for Ashford to bring his case to a local judge who might be sympathetic to a man with money and a grudge. We take your grandfather's claim, your father's filing every piece of proof you have, and we bring it directly to the Territorial Land Office ourselves. We make our claim undeniable before he ever gets the chance to file his. Nathan stared at her for a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that looked almost like awe. You've thought this through already. I spent my whole childhood watching my father lose a farm to men smarter and crueler than he was, because he trusted the system to be fair and didn't act until it was too late to matter. Clara's voice went hard with old grief. I will not watch that happen twice. Not to this family, not to you, this family. Nathan repeated softly, and something in the way he said it, quiet wondering like he was testing whether the words fit, made Clara's breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Was that too forward? She asked, suddenly unsure. I only meant, no. Nathan reached across the table and covered her hand with his rough and warm and steady. No, Clara. It wasn't too forward at all. It's the first time anyone's called this house a family in 4 years, and I find I like the sound of it a great deal. For a moment, the danger circling them, Ashford the fence, the bullet, the false claim being built somewhere out of their sight, seemed to recede, just slightly crowded out by something quieter and warmer, sitting between them at that kitchen table. Then from outside, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of a horse moving fast up the drive, and whatever soft moment had been building between them shattered instantly into alertness. Nathan already rising, already reaching for the rifle, propped by the door. It was not an attacker. It was the sheriff, a heavy-set man named Garrett Boyd, who Clara had met only once briefly on her first week in town, and whose face now carried the particular grimness of a man bringing news he didn't want to deliver. Nathan. Boyd's breath fogged hard in the cold as he swung down from his horse. Sorry for the hour. Figured you'd want to hear this from me directly rather than through gossip. Hear what? Byron Ashford filed a claim this afternoon at the county office. Formal challenge to your water rights backed by a lawyer out of the capital, and what he's calling new evidence of a prior claim on the same source predating your grandfather's filing. Boyd's jaw tightened. He's requested an emergency hearing. 3 weeks from now, right here in Red Hollow in front of Judge Averill. Nathan's face had gone the color of old ash. Averill. That's a judge who owes Ashford's late father a considerable favor. Yes, and everyone in this territory knows it. Boyd's voice was grim. I'm not saying the hearing's rigged before it starts. I'm saying you'd be a fool not to walk in prepared for it to feel that way. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her, the warm moment from minutes ago replaced entirely by cold, sharp fear. 3 weeks. 3 weeks to prove 60 years of clean legal claim against a man with money, a favorable judge, and apparently no limit to how far he was willing to go shooting sabotage, and now a courtroom built on lies. 3 weeks. Nathan repeated slowly, and something in his voice had gone flat and hard. A man doing arithmetic on a fight he'd just realized was far more dangerous than he'd let himself believe. 3 weeks to prove my own grandfather's land is mine. I'd start tonight if I were you, Boyd said grimly, already turning back toward his horse. And Nathan, watch your back on that road. Whatever else Ashford's willing to do to win this in a courtroom, I don't think he's given up on the idea of not needing a courtroom at all. He rode off into the dark, leaving Nathan and Clara standing together on the porch in the bitter cold, the full shape of the danger finally fully visible. Not scattered threats anymore. Not vague warnings whispered across a store counter, but a deadline, a judge, and 3 weeks to save everything Nathan Cole had ever built. 3 weeks, Clara said quietly, echoing him, feeling the weight of it settle over her like the winter itself. Nathan turned to look at her. And despite the fear plain in his face, there was something else there too. Resolve steady and unshaken, the look of a man who had decided, whatever the cost exactly, how hard he intended to fight. "Then we've got 3 weeks to get it right," he said. "And I don't intend to lose this valley to a man who's never once fought fair in his life." Behind them inside the house, the lamp still burned over the kitchen table, where the old map lay spread beside the deed proof of a claim 60 years old, waiting to be carried to a fight neither of them had asked for, and neither of them intended to lose. By the time the sun came up, Nathan already had every scrap of paper his family had ever kept spread across the kitchen table. And Clara was standing over the stove making coffee strong enough to keep them both upright through what promised to be a very long 3 weeks. "We need more than the deed," Nathan said, rubbing a hand over his unshaven jaw, eyes red from a night spent barely sleeping. "Averil's going to want to see it laid out clean, filing dates, survey markers, witnesses, if we can find any still living who remember my grandfather working this land before anyone else set foot on it. Witnesses!" Clara set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table, pulling the old map toward her, studying the careful lines her husband's grandfather had drawn decades before either of them was born. "Hazel's family has been here almost as long as yours. Would her husband testify to what he knows? Frank Prentice would testify to the sky being blue if it meant sticking a thumb in Byron Ashford's eye." A ghost of a smile crossed Nathan's tired face. "His father and mine were close. He'd have stories if we need them." "Then that's one witness." Clara reached for a scrap of paper and began writing her handwriting, quick and decisive. The same efficient hand that had once kept her father's farm accounts before everything fell apart. "What about the recorder's office? You said the deed was clean when you checked 3 weeks ago. Can we get a certified copy, something official? Something that can't be argued with in front of a judge?" "I can ride in today." "We can ride in today," Clara corrected, already standing, already reaching for her coat. "I'm not sitting in this house waiting to hear how the fight's going, Nathan. I told you that already." Nathan looked up at her, and something in his exhausted face softened, despite everything pressing down on them. "I remember. I just didn't expect to have to remind myself so soon that you meant it." The ride to the county recorder's office took most of the morning, the road still thick with old snow, and Clara used every mile of it to press Nathan for the parts of the story he hadn't told her yet. The deeper history between the Coles and the Ashfords, the exact nature of the grudge that had apparently been simmering for 3 generations, and had finally in the space of a few short weeks boiled over into bullets and false claims. "My grandfather and Byron's grandfather came into this territory the same year," Nathan said, guiding the wagon carefully around a rutted stretch of road. "Old Ashford wanted the water. Everybody wanted the water. A valley like this, water's worth more than gold most years. But my grandfather got here first, filed first, and built first. Ashford never forgave that. Told anyone who'd listened for 30 years that the filing was somehow unfair rigged, though he never could say exactly how a man simply arriving first and doing the paperwork properly counted as cheating. And it's passed down, father to son to grandson. Like a disease." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Byron's father tried to buy the water rights outright when I was a boy. My father refused. There was talk for years of legal challenges that never quite materialized. I think old Ashford knew even then he didn't have grounds, not real ones. But money and grudges have a way of finding grounds eventually, if a man's patient enough and willing to lie. And Byron's decided he's done being patient. Byron's decided," Nathan said grimly, "that a woman walking into my life gave him the perfect excuse to make his move now, while everyone in the territory's already gossiping and looking for a reason to doubt this family. Divide and weaken, Clara. That's his whole strategy. Make people doubt you, make people doubt me. Make the ground under both of us feel less solid before he ever sets foot in a courtroom." Clara absorbed that in silence for a moment, watching the pine trees slide past heavy with old snow. "Then we don't let the ground feel less solid," she said finally. "We make it feel like bedrock. Starting today." The recorder's office was a cramped little building at the edge of the county seat, run by a nervous balding clerk named Whitfield, who went visibly pale the moment Nathan explained why they'd come. "Mr. Cole, Whitfield glanced toward the door, as though expecting someone to walk through it and catch him mid-sentence. I should tell you someone else came asking about your file. Recently. Very recently. Clara felt Nathan go still beside her. Ashford, I didn't say that. Whitfield's eyes darted again. I'm only saying the file's been handled. More than usual for a deed 60 years settled. I noted it because it struck me odd. Handled how? Nathan's voice had gone low dangerous, in a way Clara hadn't heard from him since the night of the shooting. I couldn't say for certain, but I'd swear the survey attachment, the original boundary markers, the ones your grandfather filed alongside the main deed. I'd swear there were more pages in that file 2 months ago than there are now. The words landed like a stone, dropped into still water ripples, spreading out through everything Clara had believed about the fight they were walking into. You're telling me pages are missing, Nathan said slowly. I'm telling you I noticed something odd, and I don't feel comfortable saying more than that with my job on the line, Mr. Cole. I have a family, too. Whitfield's hands were shaking slightly as he pulled the file from its drawer and set it on the counter between them. What's here is here. I'll certify true copies of everything that remains gladly today, no charge. Beyond that, I can't say what I don't know for certain. Nathan opened the file with hands that Clara could see were carefully steady, forcing calm onto fingers that clearly wanted to shake. He went through the pages one by one, and Clara watched his face change confusion, then something colder, then a kind of grim, contained fury that frightened her more than shouting would have. The original survey markers, he said quietly. The ones showing the water source boundary, specifically cross-referenced against the county's earlier informal claims log. They're gone. Someone removed them, Clara said, though it wasn't really a question. Someone removed exactly the pages that would make it hardest to argue there was ever a prior claim on this water. Nathan's voice was tight with barely leashed anger. Which means whoever's behind this didn't just build a false story out of nothing, Clara. They came here first and made sure the true story had a hole in it before they told their lie. They left the recorder's office with what certified copies remained and a knot of fear sitting hard in Clara's stomach that hadn't been there that morning. It was one thing to fight a false claim with clean, complete proof on their side. It was another thing entirely to discover the proof itself had been tampered with quietly weeks ago, long before either of them had understood there was a fight coming at all. There has to be another copy somewhere, Clara said as they climbed back into the wagon. A man like your grandfather, careful enough to file a claim with full survey markers, surely he kept his own records too. Nathan went very still, something shifting behind his tired eyes. The trunk, he said slowly. In the attic. My father's things, and his father's before him. I never went through all of it after Rebecca died. I didn't have the heart, and after that I just never got around to it. He looked at Clara with something that might have been the first real hope she'd seen on his face all day. If my grandfather kept a personal copy of his own survey separate from what he filed with the county, then Ashford can steal pages from a government office all he likes, Clara finished, and it won't matter because the truth will still exist somewhere he can't reach it. Nathan didn't answer with words. He simply flicked the reins harder than he needed to, and the wagon lurched forward into a pace that ate up the road toward home considerably faster than the pace that had carried them out. The attic was cold and thick with dust, lit only by the single lantern Nathan carried as they climbed the narrow stairs, and Clara felt the weight of decades pressing down from every direction. Trunks, old furniture draped in cloth, the particular silence of things left untouched by grief for far too long. There! Nathan's voice was rough as he set the lantern down beside a heavy trunk pushed into the far corner, initials burned into the lid that Clara couldn't quite make out in the low light. This was his, my grandfather's. I remember my father saying he kept everything in here, letters, ledgers, everything he never trusted to leave the house. The lock was old and stiff, but it gave after a few hard turns of the key Nathan produced from a ring he'd clearly been carrying since he inherited the ranch, and never once had reason to use. Inside, layered in the particular yellowed fragility of paper that had sat undisturbed for decades, were bundles of letters, a worn leather ledger, and Clara's breath caught as Nathan carefully lifted it free, a rolled survey map tied with string, gone brittle with age. Nathan's hands shook as he untied it, spreading it flat on the dusty attic floor by lantern light, and there it was, the same boundary lines as the map downstairs, but more detailed, annotated in a firm, careful hand, complete with markers along the water source that matched line for line the very pages that had gone missing from the county file. "This is it," Nathan breathed. "This is everything Ashford tried to erase." "Nathan!" Clara's voice had gone tight urgent, her eyes catching on something at the bottom corner of the map that Nathan, still stunned with relief, hadn't noticed yet. "Look, there's a signature here, a witness signature alongside your grandfather's. Someone else signed this survey when it was made." Nathan leaned closer, squinting at the faded ink. "Ezra Prentice." He read slowly, and then looked up at Clara with something like disbelief crossing his exhausted face. "Frank's grandfather. Hazel's husband's grandfather. He witnessed the original survey." "Which means," Clara said, feeling something like hope crack open in her chest, for the first time since Sheriff Boyd had ridden up their drive 3 nights ago. "The Prentice family doesn't just have stories about your family, Nathan. They have a direct link to this exact survey going back 3 generations. If Frank still has any of his grandfather's papers, then we'd have 2 independent lines of proof," Nathan finished, "instead of just one file that Ashford's already proven he's willing to tamper with." They rode for the Prentice Ranch that same evening, the map carefully rolled and wrapped against the cold, both of them running on nothing but coffee and adrenaline, and the particular exhaustion of people who had gone from despair to hope and back again more times in the last few days than either of them could easily count. Hazel met them at the door, took one look at Nathan's face, and called over her shoulder for Frank before either of them had said a single word. "You found something," she said. It wasn't a question. "We found everything," Nathan said, and for the first time in days, something like a real smile broke through the strain on his face. "Hazel, does Frank still have his grandfather's old papers? Anything from the early days of the valley?" Frank Prentice appeared in the doorway behind his wife, a big, quiet man with the same weathered solidity as Hazel, and something in his face went sharp with interest at the question. "In the barn. Never had the heart to burn them, never had much reason to go through them either." "Why?" Nathan unrolled the map on the Prentice kitchen table, and Clara watched Frank's face change as he leaned over it, tracing the faded signature at the bottom corner with something like reverence. "That's my grandfather's hand?" Frank said quietly. "I'd know it anywhere. He used to sign the family Bible the same way, same little flourish on the E." He looked up at Nathan, something solemn passing between the two men. "If Byron Ashford's trying to say there's no proof your family's claim came first and no proof it was ever done honest, then we're about to make that a very hard lie to tell in front of a judge," Hazel finished grimly. "Frank, go get that trunk from the barn. Tonight. I don't care that it's dark and cold out there. Byron Ashford's already proven he's willing to steal evidence out of a government office. I won't put it past him to try the same thing here if word gets out what we've found." They spent that night at the Prentice table by lamplight, going through Ezra Prentice's old papers page by careful page, and by the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the kitchen window, they had exactly what they needed. A witnessed account written in Ezra's own hand decades ago, describing the day he'd stood beside Nathan's grandfather and watched him drive the first survey stake into the ground along the water source months before any Ashford had set foot in the valley at all. "This is it," Nathan said, voice hoarse with exhaustion and something close to disbelief. "This is everything. Independent proof a witness family with no reason to lie for us, dates that line up exact with the county filing." He looked up at Clara across the table, eyes red-rimmed but bright, with something that looked for the first time in days like real confidence. "Avril can be as friendly to Ashford as he wants. He can't argue with 2 separate families' original records lining up exact 60 years apart, never having been compared to each other until tonight. We still have to get through the hearing." Clara said, cautious, even in the face of relief, because 300 miles of hard-won lessons had taught her that good news rarely arrived without a complication hiding just behind it. Ashford's not going to sit quiet just because we found what he tried to hide. If he's willing to shoot at you on a road and tamper with county records, what's he going to do when he realizes we've found a way around both? The question hung in the room, heavier than the exhaustion, heavier than the relief, and Nathan's face sobered as the truth of it settled over him. "You're right," he said quietly. "This isn't over. It's just gotten more dangerous because now he knows we're not going to fold." The warning came faster than either of them expected. They were only 2 days back on the ranch, still cataloging and organizing the evidence for the hearing, when Clara answered a knock at the door to find a boy she didn't recognize, no older than 12, breathless from riding hard, holding out a folded note with hands red from the cold. "Man paid me $1 to bring this," the boy said. "Said to put it straight in Mrs. Cole's hands, nobody else's." Clara's stomach turned cold even before she unfolded it. Nathan appeared in the doorway behind her, alerted by something in her posture, and read over her shoulder as she scanned the few short lines written in a hand neither of them recognized. Mrs. Cole. "Your husband's grandfather wasn't the only man with old friends in this valley. Some debts run deeper than water rights. Ask him what happened to Thomas Reyes in the spring of 1852, and ask yourself whether a man who'd bury that kind of secret is a man worth defending in front of a judge, a friend of the truth." The color drained from Nathan's face so fast, Clara actually reached out to steady him, alarmed. "Nathan, who's Thomas Reyes?" For a long, terrible moment, Nathan said nothing at all, and the silence itself told Clara more than she wanted to know, that whatever name had just been written on that note, it meant something. Something old and buried, and clearly capable of shaking a man who hadn't so much as flinched at a bullet wound days before. "Nathan." Her voice had gone very quiet. "Tell me." "It's not what you think," Nathan said, and his voice had gone rough, unsteady, in a way that frightened her more than the note itself. "Clara, I need you to trust me when I say there's history here that isn't mine to tell alone, and it has nothing to do with the deed, nothing to do with whether this land is rightfully ours." "Then whose is it to tell?" Clara's fear was sharpening now into something closer to alarm, watching her husband steady, honest, careful Nathan Cole look more shaken than she'd seen him since the moment Sheriff Boyd rode up with news of Ashford's claim. "Nathan, we agreed. No secrets. That was the whole foundation of everything between us. And now there's a name in a note that's turned you white as that snow outside, and you're telling me it's not mine to know." "It's my father's," Nathan said finally, the words dragged out of him like they cost something physical to say. "It's my father's secret, and it's been buried 30 years, and God help me, Clara. I don't even know the whole truth of it myself. Only pieces, only what I overheard as a boy and was never supposed to hear at all." Outside, the wind was picking up again, rattling the shutters, and Clara stood in the doorway with the note still trembling slightly in her hand, understanding with a sinking, certain dread that whatever storm they'd been fighting, the shooting, the fence, the false claim, the missing pages, none of it had prepared either of them for the one that was about to come from inside their own family instead of from Byron Ashford's schemes at all. "Then it's time you found out the whole truth," Clara said quietly, folding the note with careful, steady hands despite the fear coursing through her. "Because if Byron Ashford already knows enough to write this note and threaten us with it, then whatever this secret is, Nathan, it's not going to stay buried much longer whether we're ready or not. Better we know it first together than let a courtroom be the place you find out what your own father did." Nathan looked at her for a long moment, something raw and frightened and grateful moving across his face all at once. And when he finally spoke, his voice had steadied into something that sounded, despite everything, like a man bracing himself to finally face a truth he'd spent his whole life avoiding. "Then I know where to start," he said. "There's only one person left alive who might know the whole of it. My father's oldest friend, if he's willing to talk." They rode out that same afternoon to a small weathered cabin on the far eastern edge of the valley home, to an old man named Silas Corbin, who Nathan explained had worked alongside his father for close to 20 years before retiring to a quiet plot of land and an even quieter life. Silas answered the door slowly, squinting against the daylight, and something in his weathered face went carefully guarded the moment he registered who was standing on his porch. Nathan Cole. His voice was rough with age and disuse. Been a long time. Too long, Silas. I'm sorry for that. Nathan's voice was steady, but Clara could hear the tension underneath it. I need to ask you about something. A name came up. Thomas Reyes. Silas went very still, his weathered hands tightening slightly on the doorframe. For a long moment he said nothing, simply studying Nathan's face, like he was trying to decide how much the man standing in front of him could bear to hear. Come in, he said finally. This isn't a conversation for a doorstep. Inside the cabin was small and simply furnished a single fire, burning low in the hearth, and Silas settled into a worn chair with the careful slowness of a man whose joints had long since stopped forgiving sudden movement. Your father never wanted you to know, Silas said, without preamble, staring into the fire, rather than at either of them. Made me swear it more than once before he passed. But if someone's already dug up the name and started using it against you, I suppose the choice of keeping it buried isn't really mine to make anymore. What happened to him? Nathan's voice was tight. Thomas Reyes. Who was he? Ranch hand. Worked for your grandfather back in the early days before your father took over the running of things. Silas's weathered face had gone distant, pulled back into a memory 30 years old. Good man by most accounts. Married one child on the way. There was an accident during a cattle drive, a stampede spring of 1852, right around the water crossing on the north boundary. Reyes went in trying to turn the lead steers away from a group of calves that had gotten separated. Didn't come back out. An accident, Clara said slowly, watching Silas's face carefully. That doesn't sound like the kind of secret worth 30 years of silence. Silas's eyes flicked to her, something heavy and reluctant in them. It wouldn't be if that was the whole of it. But your father-in-law, Mrs. Cole, Nathan's father, he was driving that section of the herd. He was young then, maybe 20. Still learning the work, still prone to the kind of mistakes a young man makes when he's trying to prove himself faster than he's ready to be. Silas's voice had gone very quiet. There was talk after among some of the older hands that the crossing hadn't been checked properly that morning, that a fence gap upstream that should have been mended hadn't been, and that Reyes died trying to fix a mistake that wasn't his to fix at all. The silence in the cabin stretched long and terrible, and Clara watched Nathan's face go through something complicated and painful. Grief for a father he'd clearly loved, despite everything. Horror at a story he'd never been allowed to hear in full. And underneath both of those, a dawning sick understanding of exactly why his father had buried this so deep for so long. You're saying my father caused that man's death, Nathan said, his voice barely above a whisper, and covered it up. I'm saying nobody ever proved anything, Silas said carefully. Your father was cleared officially by anyone who ever asked. But officially cleared and truly innocent aren't always the same thing, and your father carried the weight of that difference every day I ever knew him right up until he died. He gave Reyes's widow money for years, quiet never through official channels. Made sure the boy, Reyes's son, had work on this ranch the moment he was old enough, and made sure he was paid better than fair. Your father never forgave himself, Nathan. Whatever the truth of that morning really was, he spent the rest of his life trying to make up for it in the only ways he knew how. Nathan sat very still, hands clenched on his knees, and Clara reached over without thinking and covered one of them with her own feeling, the tension trembling underneath her palm. Where's the son now? Nathan asked finally. Reyes's boy. If my father gave him work here, left the valley years back not long after your father passed. Silas shook his head slowly. Bitter from what I heard. Felt your father's kindness came too late and covered too little, which Nathan, I won't pretend I blame the man for feeling that way, whatever your father's intentions truly were. Clara felt the pieces click together with a cold, sinking certainty, even before Nathan spoke the thought aloud. Ashford found him, Nathan said slowly. Found Reyes's son, found a man with real grief and real reason to hate this family, and offered him what money revenge. A chance to finally see the Cole name dragged through the mud, whether the land claim holds up in court or not. It would explain the note, Clara said quietly. Byron doesn't need to win the water rights case to hurt you, Nathan. If he can drag your father's name through a public hearing, make people believe the Cole claim to this land was always built on something rotten, then even if the deed holds, Nathan finished grimly, he's poisoned the well anyway. Made sure that whatever happens with the water rights, this family's name comes out of it broken. They rode home in silence, the weight of Silas's story settling over both of them like a second winter. And it was well past dark by the time Nathan finally spoke again, sitting across from Clara at the same kitchen table where days ago he'd first told her the word family and meant it. I don't know what to do with this, he admitted quietly. I've spent my whole life thinking my father was simply a good man, careful, fair. And now I find out there's a grave 30 years old with a shadow over it and a family out there somewhere who has every right to hate the name I carry. Your father wasn't simply good or simply guilty, Clara said gently. He was a man who made a mistake young and spent the rest of his life trying to be better because of it. That's not nothing, Nathan. That's not the same as what Byron Ashford's doing, building lies for profit without a single day's remorse. Try telling that to a judge who's already inclined to believe the worst of this family. Then we don't let a judge decide what this family is worth. Clara said, something steady and fierce settling into her voice. We find Thomas Reyes' son ourselves, before Ashford can use him as a weapon in that hearing. We find him and we tell him the truth. The whole truth, not the version that makes your father look worst, but not the version that hides what really happened either. We give him the chance to hear it honest from you, instead of twisted secondhand from a man who only wants to use his grief. Nathan looked at her across the table, exhaustion and grief, and something like desperate hope, all warring in his face at once. And if he doesn't want to hear it, if he's already decided whatever we say, that the Cole name deserves to be ruined, then at least he'll have heard the truth from the one man willing to say it plain, Clara said. That's more than most people ever get, Nathan. Sometimes that has to be enough. Outside, the wind had picked up again, snow beginning to fall in earnest, and somewhere out in that same dark, Clara knew Byron Ashford was almost certainly counting down the same 3 weeks they were waiting, patient and cruel for the hearing that would either finally hand him the water rights he'd wanted for 3 generations or destroy the Cole family's name so thoroughly that the land itself would hardly matter anymore. 2 mysteries were racing toward the same courtroom, now tangled together in ways neither Clara nor Nathan had seen coming 3 weeks ago, in a saloon buried under snow, a false claim built on stolen pages, and an old grief buried deep enough to poison an entire family's name. And somewhere between them, Clara understood, standing up from the table and reaching for her coat. Despite the late hour, was a son who deserved the truth before Byron Ashford ever got the chance to twist it into something else entirely. "Where are you going?" Nathan asked, alarmed, as she pulled her coat tight around her shoulders. "To ask Hazel and Frank if they know where a grieving man named Reyes might have gone 30 years ago," Clara said, already moving toward the door. "Because we don't have 3 weeks to sit here grieving what your father did, Nathan Cole. We have 3 weeks to make sure the truth reaches that courtroom before the lie does. And I intend to use every single day of it." Hazel didn't even blink when Clara showed up on her porch past 9 at night, snow thick on her shoulders, and urgency written plain across her face. "Thomas Reyes," Clara said, before Hazel had even finished pulling the door open. "His son. Nathan's father gave him work here after the accident, and he left the valley bitter not long after old Mr. Cole died. Do you or Frank know where he might have gone?" Hazel's face went through several things at once. Surprise, recognition, and finally, a grim kind of understanding as she stepped back to let Clara in out of the cold. "Sit down before you fall down, and let me get Frank. This is a conversation he'll want to be part of." Frank came in from the back room, still pulling his suspenders up over his shoulders, and something in his weathered face tightened the moment Hazel repeated the name. "Daniel Reyes," Frank said slowly. "That was the boy's name. I remember him quiet sort, kept mostly to himself, Worked the coal spread maybe 4 or 5 years before he left. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, thinking hard. Last I heard, and this is years-old news, mind you, he'd taken up work at a stockyard over in Miller's Crossing. 2 days' ride east, maybe a little more with the roads the way they are this time of year. 2 days. Clara repeated, doing the arithmetic in her head even as her heart sank. We have 3 weeks until the hearing, Frank. 2 days there, 2 days back time to find him, once we arrive time to convince him to even speak with us at all. It's tight, Frank agreed grimly. But it's not impossible, and I'd wager tight and possible beats sitting here doing nothing while Ashford builds his case unopposed. Nathan wanted to leave that same night. Clara talked him into waiting until dawn, arguing rightly. Though it cost her some effort to convince a man clearly running on nothing but grief and adrenaline that riding exhausted into unfamiliar territory in the dark was a good way to end up hurt or lost, and neither of them could afford to lose a single day of the 3 weeks they had left. They left at first light. Instead, the ranch entrusted to a pair of hands. Nathan trusted Hazel, promising to keep watch on the place besides, and the road east unspooling long and cold and uncertain in front of them. I keep thinking about what I'll say to him, Nathan admitted somewhere into the first hour of riding, his breath fogging in the cold. Sorry seems too small a word for what my father's silence might have cost that family. But I don't know what else there is. You start with the truth, Clara said simply. All of it. Not the version that protects your father's memory, and not the version that damns him either. Just what Silas told us plain, and let Daniel Reyes decide for himself what to do with it. And if he decides to testify against us at the hearing anyway, if nothing I say changes his mind. Clara considered that for a long moment, watching the frozen road unwind ahead of them. Then at least he'll have heard it from you first, honest, instead of from Ashford's twisted version of it. That has to count for something, Nathan, even if it doesn't count for everything. Miller's Crossing turned out to be a rougher town than Red Hollow, built up hastily around the stockyards that gave it its name. Mud and manure and noise, where Red Hollow had snow and quiet. It took the better part of a day asking around careful, discreet questions at the stockyard office, the boarding house, the single dusty saloon, before someone finally pointed them toward a small house on the edge of town, its fence in need of mending, smoke rising thin from a chimney that had clearly seen better days. The man who answered the door was younger than Clara had expected, maybe 30, with tired eyes and a wariness that sharpened into something harder the moment Nathan gave his name. Cole. Daniel Reyes said the name like it left a bad taste. I wondered when someone from that family would finally come looking for me. Took you long enough. Mr. Reyes, I know why you're here. Daniel's hand tightened on the doorframe, knuckles going white. Man came through here about 2 weeks back. Fancy-dressed, smooth-talking. Byron Ashford, he said his name was. Offered me money, good money, to come to some hearing and tell a judge what I know about how my father really died. His eyes cut to Nathan, hard and unforgiving. Offered me money to say your father as good as killed mine, and covered it up to protect this family's precious name, which, from what old Silas apparently finally admitted, isn't even far from the truth, is it? The words hit Nathan like a physical blow, and Clara watched her husband absorb it, jaw tight, refusing to look away, even though every instinct probably screamed at him to. I won't pretend it's not the truth, Nathan said quietly. Or close enough to it that the difference doesn't much matter to you. My father was young driving that section of herd, and there was a fence gap upstream that should have been mended and wasn't. Your father died trying to fix a mistake that wasn't his to fix. I only found out the whole of it 3 days ago. Mr. Reyes, and I understand if that means nothing to you. I understand if 30 years of silence from my family means an apology now is too small, too late, and too convenient. Daniel's face flickered surprise, maybe at hearing the truth spoken plain instead of defended or denied. You came all this way just to admit that 2 days' ride in this weather, just to tell me what I already knew. I came because Byron Ashford is using your father's death as a weapon, Nathan said. Not because he cares one bit about you or your family's grief, Mr. Reyes, but because he wants my land, and he's decided the fastest way to get it is to drag my father's worst mistake into a courtroom and let it poison everything else I'm trying to prove is true and clean. He doesn't care if his story about you and your father is honest. He cares if it's useful. Something in Daniel's face shifted, a crack appearing in the hard wariness he'd greeted them with. And your version's more honest, is that it? Just because you rode 2 days to say it to my face instead of paying me to say it in front of a judge. I don't know if it's more honest, Nathan admitted. I only know it's the truth, as I understand it offered, without asking you for anything in return. Ashford wants you to hate my family enough to lie for him in that courtroom. I'm not asking you to forgive my father, or to love the Cole name, or to do anything at all except hear what actually happened from someone who only found out himself 3 days ago and came straight here, rather than let you keep believing whatever twisted version Ashford's already planted in your head. The silence stretched long between them, cold and heavy, and Clara watched Daniel Reyes's face war with itself, grief old and unresolved against a growing grudging recognition that the man standing on his porch hadn't come to buy his silence or beg his forgiveness, only to tell him the truth and let him do with it what he would. My mother, Daniel said finally, voice rough, took money from your father for years. Quiet money through no official channel right up until she died. I always thought it was guilt money. Blood money. I hated the sight of it even as a boy, even knowing we needed it to eat some winters. He looked down at his own hands. But she never once let me refuse it. Said your father's silence was a coward's silence, but his money wasn't cowardly at all. Said a man who truly didn't care wouldn't have kept paying for 30 years without anyone ever forcing him to. I didn't know any of that until 3 days ago, Nathan said quietly. I'm sorry, that doesn't undo 30 years of you not knowing it either. Daniel was quiet a long moment, studying Nathan's face like he was trying to decide something important. Ashford offered me $200, he said finally, to come to Red Hollow and tell a judge my father's death was murder dressed up nice as an accident, which it wasn't murder, I mean. Whatever else it was, Silas Corbin telling you fence neglect and young carelessness, that's not the same as murder, whatever Ashford wants a judge to believe. No, Nathan agreed. It wasn't murder. It was a tragedy, and maybe a failure of duty that a young man should have caught and didn't, and 30 years of guilt my father apparently carried alone instead of ever telling the truth to the people who deserved to hear it. But it wasn't murder, and I don't think you believe it was either, whatever Ashford's paying you to say. Daniel exhaled slowly, some of the tension finally draining out of his shoulders. No, he admitted. I don't believe that. I've never believed that, whatever bitterness I've carried about the rest of it. He looked between Nathan and Clara, something almost like exhaustion in his face. Now the anger burning down into something quieter and sadder. I turned Ashford's money down, if that's what you're really here to ask. Told him I wasn't interested in dressing up my father's death as a murder, just to help some rich man steal a valley. But I hadn't decided yet whether I'd testify at all, whether the truth, even honest, was worth dragging back into daylight after 30 years of trying not to think about it. And now? Clara asked gently. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then back at Nathan. Now I think, he said slowly, that if I'm going to speak on this at all, I'd rather it be the honest version told by the man honest enough to ride 2 days in the cold to tell me himself than the twisted version some rich stranger tried to buy out of my grief. He straightened, something settling in his face that looked almost like relief, the release of a weight carried far too long. I'll come to your hearing, Mr. Cole, not for Ashford's money, and not exactly for your family's sake either, if I'm honest, but because 30 years of silence poisoned my whole childhood, and I think maybe the only way to finally set it down is to say the truth once out loud in front of people who need to hear it, including a judge who apparently needs reminding that grief and guilt aren't the same thing as a stolen land claim. They rode back to Red Hollow with 2 days shaved dangerously close off their 3-week window, but with something in the wagon that felt to Clara far more valuable than time. A witness who would speak the truth, instead of Ashford's manufactured lie. A chapter of old grief finally brought into daylight, instead of festering in silence, and a marriage that had been tested in the space of one impossible week, far harder than most marriages were tested in a decade. "You were remarkable back there," Nathan said quietly, somewhere in the last stretch of road before the ranch came into view. "I don't know that I could have found the words myself if you hadn't been standing beside me, reminding me what honesty actually looks like when it's hard." "You found the words," Clara said. "I just made sure you didn't lose your nerve before you got the chance to say them." Nathan glanced at her sideways, something warm and unguarded in his tired face, despite everything they'd just been through. "Clara, I need to say something, and I need you to let me say it plain the way you're always asking me to be plain with you. All right, I didn't marry you because I needed a worker, and I didn't marry you because I needed someone to simply share this house so it stopped feeling so empty." He pulled the wagon to a slow stop, turning to face her fully despite the cold. "I married you because that night in the saloon, watching you refuse Color's offer, even half frozen and starving, I saw a kind of strength I hadn't seen in anyone in 4 years, not since Rebecca, and every single day since, watching you fight for this ranch like it was yours before you ever had reason to love it. Watching you ride to Hazel's in the middle of the night to chase down a 30-year-old secret because you refused to let a lie win Clara. I think I fell in love with you, somewhere in the middle of all of it, and I don't know exactly when, but I know it's true, and I didn't want to keep it from you one more day. And my key. What is someone?" Clara sat very still, the cold forgotten entirely, her heart hammering so hard she was certain Nathan could hear it even over the wind. "Nathan, you don't have to say it back," he said quickly, some of his careful control cracking into visible nervousness. "I know this started as an arrangement. I know you never promised. I love you too." Clara said, cutting him off before he could talk himself further into doubt, and the words came out simpler and truer than she'd expected them to, like they'd been sitting ready in her chest for days, just waiting for the right moment to be spoken. "I think I have for a while now, if I'm honest. I just didn't know how to say it in the middle of bullets and false claims and 30-year-old secrets." Nathan's face broke into something Clara hadn't seen from him yet. Pure, unguarded joy, the careful control of the last 4 years finally fully undone. He reached for her, and the kiss that followed was nothing like the careful questioning kiss at their wedding. It was certain. It was real. It tasted like relief and hope and every hard mile they'd walked together to arrive at this exact moment. "We still have a hearing to win," Clara murmured against his mouth, laughing despite herself. "Then let's go win it," Nathan said, "as a family that isn't pretending anymore." But the ranch that greeted them when they finally rolled up the drive was not the quiet, waiting home Clara had hoped for. Smoke was rising from the barn, not the thin, controlled smoke of a chimney fire, but thick, black, urgent smoke that sent Nathan's whole body rigid before Clara had even fully registered what she was seeing. The barn! Nathan was already moving, snapping the reins hard, the wagon lurching forward at a pace that nearly threw Clara from her seat. They arrived to chaos, 2 of Nathan's hired hands already fighting the flames with buckets and blankets. The horses screaming inside, and Nathan was off the wagon and running before it had fully stopped shouting orders, throwing himself into the fight with a desperation that made Clara's heart seize with fear, even as she grabbed a bucket herself and joined the line. It took the better part of an hour, soot-blackened and exhausted, before the fire was finally beaten back to smoldering embers, and by then the damage was done. Half the barn's roof gone. 2 horses lost to smoke before anyone could reach them. And Nathan standing in the wreckage with his face carved from something harder and colder than Clara had ever seen on him. "This wasn't an accident," he said, kicking at a scorched timber, and Clara didn't need him to explain further. Everyone standing in that ruined barn already understood exactly whose hand had lit this fire and exactly what message it had been meant to send. "He knew we were gone," Clara said quietly, horror and fury tangled together in her chest. "He knew we'd ridden to Miller's Crossing, and he used the time to hit us here where we couldn't stop it. He's running out of patience," Nathan said grimly. "The hearing's less than 2 weeks away now, and every scheme he's tried so far hasn't broken us the way he wanted. So he's escalating. First a warning shot, then a cut fence, now my barn, my horses. His jaw tightened, something dangerous and controlled moving behind his eyes. Next time, Clara, it might not just be property. The fear that settled over Clara then was different from anything she'd felt yet in this fight. Not fear for the land, not fear for the deed or the water rights, or even the old grief of Thomas Reyes, finally brought to light. But a colder, more personal fear, the understanding that Byron Ashford's cruelty had no obvious ceiling, and that the closer they got to beating him in that courtroom, the more dangerous he was likely to become. Sheriff Boyd arrived within the hour, summoned by one of the hands who'd ridden hard for town the moment the fire was spotted, and his face was grim as he surveyed the wreckage of the barn. "I can't prove Ashford did this," Boyd said, crouching to examine a scorched patch near the barn's foundation that Nathan insisted looked deliberately set, not accidental. "Not without a witness, not without something concrete. But I don't believe in coincidence any more than you two do." "Then what good are you, Sheriff, if you can't stop him?" The words came out sharper than Clara intended, exhaustion and fear stripping away her usual careful diplomacy. Boyd didn't take offense. His weathered face only softened with something like genuine sympathy. "I know it feels that way, Mrs. Cole. I promise you I'm not simply standing by. I've already sent word to the Territorial Marshal's office requesting extra patrols along this stretch of road until your hearing's done. It's not everything, but it's something." "It's not enough," Nathan said, voice tight with barely controlled fury, staring at the ruin of the barn his own hands had helped build years ago. "No," Boyd agreed heavily. "It's not enough. But short of catching the man with a match still in his hand, it's what the law can offer you right now. The rest, I'm afraid, is going to come down to that hearing, and whether the evidence you've gathered is strong enough to end this fight before Ashford finds something even worse to try." Bouchier. The days that followed the fire took on a grimmer, more urgent shape. Nathan doubled the watch on the property, hired 2 additional hands specifically to patrol through the night, and Clara found herself sleeping with a loaded rifle propped within reach of the bed for the first time in her life. A fact that would have seemed impossible to her 3 weeks ago, and now felt like simple, necessary caution. They spent every spare hour preparing for the hearing, organizing the certified copies from the county recorder, the survey map from the attic trunk, Ezra Prentice's witnessed account from decades past, and now added to the pile of proof. A written statement from Daniel Reyes, carefully worded, describing Ashford's attempt to buy false testimony and confirming in his own words that his father's death had been tragedy and neglect, never murder, whatever story Ashford had hoped to plant in a judge's mind. "It's strong," Frank Prentice said, reviewing the assembled evidence at the Cole kitchen table one evening. Hazel beside him nodding slowly as she read through each document in turn. "Stronger than anything Ashford's likely built with stolen pages and bought testimony that fell through. But Averil's still his friend. Whatever the law says, the evidence shows. You'd be wise to prepare for him to find some reason to delay or twist the proceedings, even faced with proof this solid. Then we make it impossible for even a friendly judge to twist," Clara said, already reorganizing the papers into a cleaner, more devastating order. "We don't just present proof, Frank. We present a story so complete, so airtight, that even a judge inclined to help Ashford has no honest room left to maneuver." Nathan watched her work with something like awe plain on his tired face. "I married a woman who nearly died walking into this valley with nothing but $11 and a coat that didn't keep out the cold," he said quietly. "And somewhere along the way, she became the sharpest legal mind in this entire fight. I spent my whole childhood watching men with more money and more power than my father take everything he had piece by piece because he never learned to fight back smart," Clara said, not looking up from the papers. "I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to stop that from happening to someone I loved, I'd use every hard lesson it cost me." 5 days before the hearing, with the evidence finally organized, and Daniel Reyes's statement safely secured alongside everything else, Nathan received a visitor he hadn't expected, Byron Ashford himself. Riding up the drive alone, unarmed, as far as anyone could see, his easy smile firmly back in place, despite the ruin of the barn still visible behind Nathan's shoulder. "Mr. Cole?" Ashford dismounted with his usual theatrical grace eyes, flicking briefly unmistakably toward the burned wreckage before returning to Nathan's face. "Terrible thing, a fire. I heard about it in town. My condolences." "Your condolences," Nathan repeated flatly. "For a fire I have every reason to believe you set." Ashford's smile didn't waver, but something colder moved behind his eyes. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Cole, and one I'd advise you to keep to yourself in front of a judge who's already inclined to see this whole dispute as a simple matter of property law, not personal vendetta." He glanced toward the house where Clara had appeared on the porch, drawn by the sound of hoofbeats. "Mrs. Cole, I trust you and your husband found what you were looking for on your trip east." The words landed with deliberate weight, and Clara felt her stomach clench. He knew. Somehow he knew exactly where they'd ridden and why. "I don't believe that's any business of yours, Mr. Ashford," Clara said evenly, coming down the porch steps to stand beside Nathan. "Perhaps not." Ashford's smile widened thin and cold. "I only mention it because I'd hate for either of you to walk into that hearing believing you've found some magic answer that ends this cleanly. I've spent 30 years and a great deal of money making certain this ends in my favor, Mr. Cole. I'd think carefully before assuming one trip to Miller's Crossing has changed that." "We'll let the judge decide what's changed," Nathan said, voice hard. "In the meantime, Mr. Ashford, I'd think carefully about riding onto my property again given the circumstances. You're not welcome here, and I won't be responsible for what happens if you test that a second time." Ashford's easy smile finally cracked just slightly, something sharper and more dangerous showing through underneath. "5 days, Cole," he said, swinging back up onto his horse. "5 days, and one way or another this ends. I'd suggest you spend them making peace with whichever way it goes." He rode off without another word, and Clara watched him disappear over the ridge with a cold certainty settling deep in her chest that whatever calm confidence they'd built over the last week, Byron Ashford, wasn't finished yet, and the 5 days left before the hearing were likely to be the most dangerous of the entire fight. "He knows about Daniel," she said quietly, once Ashford was well out of sight. "He knows we found him, that he turned down the money. Which means he's already thinking about what else he can throw at us before that hearing, something we haven't planned for yet." Nathan's jaw was tight, his eyes still fixed on the empty ridge where Ashford had disappeared. "Then we don't give him 5 quiet days to think of something," he said grimly. "We use every one of them to make sure there's nothing left for him to find." Behind them, the burned skeleton of the barn stood stark against the snow, a physical reminder of exactly how far Byron Ashford was willing to go. And somewhere out past the ridge, Clara knew he was already searching for the next weapon to use against them, with 5 days left, and nothing, it seemed, that he wasn't willing to try. The next blow came on the 3rd day, and it came for Clara directly. She was in town with Hazel, picking up the last of the supplies before the hearing, when a man Clara didn't recognize fell into step beside her outside the general store, his voice pitched low, meant only for her. "Mrs. Cole, a word if you don't mind." "I don't believe we've met. Grayson, I'm an attorney out of the capital." He smiled easy and practiced the same brand of smoothness she'd learned to recognize on Byron Ashford. "I represent Mr. Ashford's interests in the upcoming hearing. I only wanted to extend a courtesy. Mr. Ashford's willing to settle this whole matter quietly before it ever reaches Judge Averill's bench. A fair price for a portion of the water rights. No hearing, no public spectacle, no more unfortunate accidents on either side." "You mean no more fires he sets," Clara said flatly, "or bullets his hired men put in my husband's arm." Grayson's smile didn't waver, but something in his eyes sharpened. "I only know what I've been asked to offer Mrs. Cole. A generous settlement available until the morning of the hearing. After that, my client intends to pursue the matter fully, and I understand he's recently acquired testimony that could prove quite damaging to your husband's family name, regardless of how the water rights themselves are ultimately decided." Hazel's hand closed hard around Clara's arm, a silent warning, but Clara didn't need it. She'd already understood exactly what kind of threat was being dressed up as a courtesy. "Tell your client," Clara said, voice steady despite the fury coiling tight in her chest, that we'll see him in front of Judge Averill, and that no amount of pressure between now and then is going to change what the truth already proves. Grayson's smile finally faded into something colder. As you wish, Mrs. Cole. I'll pass that along. He tipped his hat and walked away, and Clara stood there in the cold a long moment watching him go, feeling the walls closing in tighter with every day that brought them closer to the hearing. She told Nathan everything the moment she got home, and watched his face darken with a fury that had been building steadily for weeks, finally reaching some quiet breaking point. "He's threatening you now," Nathan said, pacing the kitchen floor. "Not just me, not just the land. You." "He's desperate," Clara said. "Desperate men make threats because they've run out of better ideas. That's not weakness we should ignore, Nathan, but it's not strength either. If he had something truly damning, he wouldn't be offering to settle quietly. He'd already be using it." Nathan stopped pacing, something in Clara's logic visibly settling him. "You think he's bluffing?" "I think he's throwing everything he has at the wall 2 days before the hearing, hoping something sticks before it's too late to matter." Clara reached for his hand, steadying him the way she'd learned to do over these last hard weeks. "We don't fold now. Not after everything it's cost us to get here." The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear. The whole valley sitting still under a sky scrubbed pale blue, as if even the weather understood the weight of what was about to happen. The Red Hollow meeting hall was packed tight benches full of ranchers and townsfolk who'd come to watch Prudence Hale seated near the front, with her mouth already pressed into a thin, judgmental line, and Byron Ashford across the aisle in a suit too fine for a frontier, hearing his smile firmly in place, his lawyer beside him with a leather case full of papers. Judge Averill took his seat with the bored efficiency of a man who'd already half decided how this would go, and Clara felt Nathan's hand tighten around hers under the table as the proceedings began. Ashford's lawyer went first, laying out a smooth, confident narrative, a prior claim conveniently undocumented, in the county's remaining files, witnesses to speak of irregularities, and a dark hint, delivered with practiced solemnity, of a Cole family history, stained by an old, unresolved death. "We intend to show," Grayson said, "that the Cole claim to this water source has never been as clean as the family would have this territory believe, a claim built in part on land, where a man died under circumstances the family worked hard to bury." A murmur ran through the hall. Prudence Hale's eyes gleamed with vicious satisfaction. Clara felt Nathan go rigid beside her, but he didn't flinch, didn't look away exactly as they'd rehearsed. "Your Honor." Nathan's own lawyer, a careful, precise woman named Miss Adler, who Frank had recommended from the Capitol, rose calmly. "We don't dispute that a tragedy occurred on this land 30 years ago. We intend to address it fully and honestly, because unlike opposing counsel, my client has nothing to hide behind vague hints and innuendo." She called Silas Corbin first, who told the story of the accident plainly without embellishment, exactly as he'd told it in his own cabin. A young man's carelessness, a fence gap unmended. A tragedy, not a murder. And 3 decades of quiet restitution, paid without ever being forced to. Then she called Daniel Reyes. The hall went utterly silent as Daniel walked to the front, and Clara watched Byron Ashford's confident smile falter for the first time all morning. "Mr. Reyes," Miss Adler said gently, "did Byron Ashford's representative offer you money to testify that your father's death was murder deliberately concealed by the Cole family?" "He did." Daniel's voice was steady, carrying clear through the hall. $200 to say something I don't believe is true. I turned it down. Nathan Cole rode 2 days to my home to tell me the truth himself, without asking me for anything in return. And it's the same story Silas Corbin just told this court. A tragedy, not a murder. I've made my peace with that, however long it took me to get there, and I won't let a stranger use my father's memory to steal another man's land. The murmur that ran through the hall this time was different. Surprise and something like the beginning of sympathy, turning visibly away from Ashford's table. Averill's careful, bored expression had shifted into something sharper, more alert, and Clara felt the first real flicker of hope since they'd walked into that hall. But Ashford wasn't finished. His lawyer rose again, pulling a folded document from his leather case with theatrical care. Your Honor, we submit into evidence a survey document recently discovered indicating a prior claim on this water source dated 1849, 3 years before the Cole family's official filing. Nathan went rigid beside Clara, and she felt her own heart drop. This was the missing piece, the thing Ashford had clearly been building toward, and for one terrible moment, Clara feared it might genuinely be enough to unravel everything they'd fought weeks to prove. Your Honor, Miss Adler said, rising smoothly, despite the visible tension in the room. May I examine this document? Avril nodded, and the paper was passed forward. Clara watched Miss Adler's face as she studied it, and something in the careful lawyer's expression sharpened into quiet, contained satisfaction. Your Honor, she said, this document is written on paper bearing a manufacturer's watermark that, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't in production until at least 1861. I'd ask the court's indulgence to have this verified by an independent examiner before it's admitted as evidence of an 1849 claim. The hall erupted into murmurs. Ashford's face had gone white, then red, his composure finally cracking in front of the entire town. His lawyer began to protest, but Avril was already leaning forward, his earlier boredom replaced by something hard and suspicious. Bailiff, Avril said, confiscate that document for examination. Mr. Grayson, I trust you can explain to this court exactly where your client obtained a supposedly 32-year-old survey written on paper that didn't exist until a decade after that date. The silence that followed was total, and in it, Clara watched Byron Ashford's 3-generation scheme collapse in real time, right there in front of the entire town that had spent weeks whispering doubt about her marriage. Chapeau. It took another hour of testimony. The certified county copies, the attic map with Ezra Prentice's witnessed signature, Frank's own account of his grandfather's story, passed down through the family before Avril finally rapped his gavel and delivered the verdict that ended once and for all 30 years of Ashford ambition. This court finds the Cole family's claim to the water rights in question to be valid, clean, and unbroken since its original filing. Avril said, his voice carrying flat and final through the packed hall. Furthermore, given the evidence of a forged document submitted to this court, I am referring this matter to the Territorial Marshal for investigation into fraud, and I would strongly advise Mr. Ashford to secure legal counsel of his own, separate from Mr. Grayson, for what comes next. The hall broke into noise, gasps, murmurs, someone near the back who might have actually cheered, and Clara felt Nathan's hand grip hers so tight it nearly hurt both of them, too stunned by the sudden total collapse of the danger they'd been fighting for weeks to fully process it yet. Byron Ashford didn't wait for the marshal. He was on his feet and moving for the door before Avril had even finished speaking, his composure in ruins, Grayson scrambling after him with papers spilling from his case. Byron! Nathan's voice cut through the noise, and Ashford stopped, turning back with something raw and furious in his face, all his careful charm finally completely stripped away. You think this is over? Ashford said, low and vicious. You think a judge's verdict undoes 30 years? It's over, Nathan said, and his voice was steady, almost gentle, which seemed to unsettle Ashford more than fury would have. Not because a judge said so, though I'm grateful he did. It's over because you spent 3 generations trying to take something that was never going to make you happy, even if you got it. My grandfather built this land with his own hands. My father spent his life quietly trying to make right a mistake that haunted him. And I built a family here out of nothing, out of a woman who walked through a blizzard because she refused to give up. You spent your whole life chasing water rights, Byron. I spent mine building something you never once understood how to build. Ashford had no answer for that. He simply turned and walked out, Grayson trailing behind him, and the door swung shut on the last of a threat that had shadowed the Cole Ranch for weeks. The town of Red Hollow, in the way of small towns everywhere, turned on Byron Ashford's memory almost as fast as it had turned toward doubting Clara weeks before. Prudence Hale, cornered by Hazel near the hall's entrance, had the grace to look thoroughly ashamed of herself. Mrs. Cole. Prudence's voice was stiff, unpracticed at contrition. I believe I owe you an apology. Several, actually. You do? Clara said simply, without cruelty, only plain honesty. But I'd rather have your fair treatment going forward than your apology looking backward, if it's all the same to you. Prudence blinked clearly, unused to grace, offered so plainly, and nodded once, something like real respect finally settling into her sharp face. Fair enough, Mrs. Cole, fair enough. Byron Ashford left the territory within the month, the marshal's investigation into the forged document moving faster than anyone expected once witnesses started coming forward with their own stories of his tactics over the years. His land, sold off in pieces to pay legal debts, was mostly bought up by smaller ranchers who'd spent years afraid to challenge him. Red Hollow slowly began to breathe easier, without his shadow over it. The Cole Ranch, meanwhile, began to heal in ways that had nothing to do with courtrooms or deeds. The barn was rebuilt by spring bigger and better than before, half the valley showing up to help raise the new beams in a single long, exhausting, joyful day that ended with a supper laid out on tables borrowed from every ranch within 10 miles. Daniel Reyes stayed in the valley longer than he'd planned, helping with the rebuilding, and by the time he finally rode back to Miller's Crossing, something had settled between him and Nathan that looked, if not quite like friendship, at least like peace, long overdue. Your father would be glad, Daniel said the morning he left, shaking Nathan's hand firm and steady, that it finally got said out loud instead of buried. Both of us carrying that weight alone all these years that never needed to happen. Come back, Nathan said. Anytime. There's always a place at our table. Spring turned into summer, and summer into a golden autumn. Clara had never imagined watching the valley she'd nearly died walking into transform into the truest home she'd ever known. The house that had once felt too big, too empty, too full of a ghost. Neither of them talked about anymore, now rang with noise most days. Hazel and Frank over for supper, ranch hands, laughing over cards on the porch, and Clara's own careful hand finally steady on the household ledgers. A full partner in every sense Nathan had promised that first night in the saloon. It was on a clear evening, almost exactly 1 year after that terrible blizzard, that Nathan found Clara on the porch, watching the same mountains that had once seemed so cold and unforgiving, now glowing gold with the last of the sunset. "Do you remember," he said, settling beside her, "what you asked for that first night in the saloon?" "A job," Clara said, smiling. "I remember. And I gave you something else entirely." Nathan took her hand, the same rough, careful grip she'd trusted from the very first moment, though it had grown into something far deeper since. "A wife," I said, "not a worker." I meant it as an offer that night, Clara. I don't think I understood yet that it was also a promise. "You kept it," Clara said softly. "Every part of it. The partnership, the honesty, the choice always to build this together instead of you simply ruling over it." "We built it together," Nathan corrected gently. "Every piece of it. The land was already here when you arrived, Clara, but this—" He gestured at the house behind them. Warm light spilling from every window, laughter still drifting out from the kitchen where Hazel was teaching Clara's newest recipe to anyone who'd listen. "This is something we made, both of us, out of a blizzard and a courtroom and every hard thing in between." Clara looked at the mountains, gold and endless, and thought of the woman who'd collapsed on a saloon floor with $11 and nowhere left to walk, and understood with a certainty that settled deep and permanent in her chest that every hard mile of that walk had been leading her exactly here. "I didn't come looking for love," she said quietly. "I came looking for survival. I never once let myself hope for more than that. And now I have a home," Clara said. "A family and a man who taught me that survival and happiness were never supposed to be different things at all." She turned to look at him, everything she felt plain and unguarded on her face. "You said you needed a wife, not a worker, that first night. You were wrong about one thing, Nathan Cole." "What's that?" "You didn't just need a wife," Clara said, leaning into him as the last light faded gold over the valley they'd fought so hard to keep. "You needed exactly this, exactly us, and so did I." The valley settled into quiet around them, the mountains standing eternal and unbroken against the darkening sky, and in that small, hard-won home, built from nothing but courage and honesty. And a promise kept. Clara Cole finally understood that she was no longer the woman who had once begged for work in a blizzard. She was the woman who had built a home worth fighting for, and she would never have to walk alone again.